Okay, so we are live on YouTube now, and then let me start the Zoom recording. Okay, Saif, go ahead, take us away.
All right. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you all for joining session number 4 today with Brother Nazir Khan. Just give a quick background on Brother Nazir, and then we can go ahead and begin. Brother Nazir Khan, Dr. Nazir Khan, actually is a medical doctor, volunteer imam, clinical neuroscientist, Islamic theologian, and specialist in Quranic sciences. He is an assistant professor at McMaster University. He is also a doctoral candidate in Islamic theology at the University of Nottingham. He is a senior fellow at Yaqeen Institute and the author of the recently published book, The Straight Path: How Surah Al-Fatiha Addresses Modern Ideologies. And with that, his talk today is on his recently published book, The Straight Path: How Surah Al-Fatiha Addresses Modern Ideologies, which is also available for free on Yaqeen Institute's website. Before I hand it over to him, just some quick ground rules. We'll go ahead and do the lecture for about an hour, and then we'll save Q&A for the end. So feel free to type your questions in the chat or save them towards the end, and then you can come off mic and directly ask Dr. Nazir. And without further ado, I will hand it over to him.
All right, Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah walhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma alimna ma yanfa'una wa zidna ilman wa amalan wa ikhlasan ya rabbil alameen. First of all, Jazakumullah khairan to Al-Arqam Institute for inviting me for this session. It's a pleasure to meet with you all and to discuss this topic with you all. And, as we enter into the final conclusion of the month of Ramadan, and I know folks have their mind on preparations for Eid and everything, let's, just take a moment to reflect on really achieving the benefit of Ramadan and ensuring that Ramadan transforms us as individuals, and that we pray Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our fasting and our prayers, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allows us to conclude the month with His pleasure, and that He makes, the conclusion of this month a means of His divine relief to all the distressed and oppressed around the world. Ameen. One of the objectives of Ramadan that we always talk about is reconnecting with the guidance of the Quran. شهر رمضان الذي أنزل فيه القرآن هدى للناس وبينات من الهدى والفرقان. Right? So we understand that the point of reconnecting with the Quran in the month of Ramadan is not only just to do the recitation of the Quran, but the primary purpose is the guidance. It is guidance for all humanity. It is a criterion that allows us to distinguish between truth and falsehood. And that's really what, the theme is in this session, is how do we understand the Quran in a way that allows us to extract from it the features of guidance, that allows us to take from it the lessons to understand what is our worldview as Muslims, what are our moral framework, moral principles, what is our moral framework that allows us to understand how we navigate the confusion that surrounds us in the present day. And particularly when we see, we're living at a time where people are witnessing and testifying to the moral depravity of the world order, right? The complete moral dysfunction as we see the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So how do we as Muslims look to the Quran for guidance and for a remedy to the ideologies that are wreaking such devastation and destruction around the world? So that's the broad theme with which we're entering this topic. And of course, Surah Al-Fatiha is a ideal starting point. It's not only the opening chapter of the Quran, but as the Prophet Muhammad SAW told us in one hadith, it is the greatest surah of the Quran. It is the greatest surah of the Quran. And the scholars of Islam explain that Surah Al-Fatiha encompasses the guidance of the entire Quran, succinctly summarized within its verses. That's why some of the names of Surah Al-Fatiha are reflective of that. That it is Quran or Kitab. It is the mother of the book, the mother of the Quran. It encompasses all the guidance of the Quran. So this builds off of, the discussion on how do we reconnect with the Quran, how do we improve our understanding of the Arabic language. In this session, I want to talk about how do we look at the Quran as a moral framework? How do we look at Surah Al-Fatiha in particular as a framework to understand how to address. As was mentioned, this is based off of this book that you can download for free from Yaqeen Institute as a free ebook, as a free PDF. The print copy, which will be published by Cube, will be coming out in August, inshallah ta'ala, for those who prefer to have a print copy available. So in this book, what I've done is I've talked about how each segment of Surah Al-Fatiha can be linked to a particular lesson, and that lesson shows us how to address one of the ideologies that people are grappling with. So we talk about Surah Al-Fatiha, verse by verse, and in fact breaking down each verse into segment by segment. And as we do so over the course of this book, we're talking about ideologies like atheism, materialism, deism, secularism, polytheism, naturalism, relativism, progressivism, liberalism, and postmodernism. And how do we get to that point where we actually can talk about Surah Al-Fatiha and its relevance for all of these different ideologies? It may not be evident when somebody's looking at, the surah just based on the translation. So how do we get to that point? There's a few things that we need to do, and I want to kind of make this a little bit of a how-to session to explain the methodology of research that went into this work. So first of all, when we talk about, any topic related to the Quran, we first have to understand that our explanation needs to be grounded in a scholarly understanding of the Quran, right? Anyone can open up the translation of the Quran and say, well, my reflection is this verse is talking about this, or this verse is talking about that. But that's not a rigorous analysis. That's not a scholarly analysis. And, it's not based on proper guidance, right? When we're talking about guidance, if we want to understand the guidance of the Quran, we have to understand the concept and the discipline of usul al-tafsir, right? Usul al-tafsir are the principles of Quranic commentary, the principles of how to explain the Quran, how to comment upon the Quran, the hermeneutics, right? That it explained to us what the verse actually means. So when we talk about usul al-tafsir, we need to go back to the scholarly works and talk about, when we look at the works of tafsir, how did they explain the verses of the Quran based on, the other verses, other passages in the Quran based on the context of the verse where it comes in the larger surah, based on the circumstances behind the revelation of the verse, or what's called asbab al-nuzul, based on the principles of the Arabic language, based on the vocabulary of the verse, based on the understanding of the ahadith, the statements of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the teachings of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, based on the understanding of the companions and the followers of the companions, the successors, right, the tabi'een, who narrated different comments about the meaning of the verses. This is, the whole volume of data that goes into the analysis in usul al-tafsir, and scholars of tafsir have analyzed that for us. So that should be the starting point in researching and ensuring that we ensure that we have the correct understanding of the verse. So once we have the correct understanding of the verse, right, and we understand, what the words mean, who the verse is talking about, what was the occasion of revelation, these kind of things, then we can extrapolate and understand where do we apply the lessons that we take from the verse. So once we get the understanding of the verse, then we talk about what are all the lessons that can be derived from the verse and what is the application of those lessons. So that's the kind of sequential step we have to follow. Is first we start with understanding tafsir, start with understanding the verse itself, what the verse is talking about, the meaning of the verse. Once you start with the meaning, then you talk about lessons. Once you talk about lessons, then you talk about application. Okay, so proceeding in this stepwise fashion is really important. A person may open up a translation or read one interpretation of a verse, and they come up with a whole explanation or theory based on that. And then somebody points out, well, actually, the interpretation of the verse that you mentioned is weak, or maybe it's present, but it's not the dominant interpretation. Maybe there's many other interpretations, or there's another interpretation that was preferred by the companions or has stronger evidence behind it. So that's where it's important to really ensure that we ground our explanations in proper research and proper understanding of the Quranic verses. And besides having the right research methodology, the best way to understand how to link the Quranic guidance with contemporary challenges is to really reflect on how does this particular verse, once we've understood it correctly, how does this particular verse inform our ethical values? How does this particular verse inform our worldview? How does this particular verse establish for us our principles of aqidah, our principles of belief, of theology that forms the bedrock of how we engage with different challenges in the world? So what's happening today is we have Muslims whose cultural identity is Islam, but their actual aqidah, different ideologies we're talking about. So you may have somebody who says, well, I'm a practicing Muslim. I spent the month of Ramadan fasting and praying, but the way they understand right and wrong comes out of postmodernism, or it comes out of liberalism, or it comes out of secularism. And they've totally internalized the doctrines of these ideologies. So they've actually fallen prey to what we call people understand the physical manifestation of colonialism. Okay, there's one nation that is exploiting the resources of another nation and subjugating its indigenous population, or genociding and ethnic cleansing its indigenous population. That's the physical manifestation of colonialism. But there is also an intellectual manifestation of colonialism, or a cultural manifestation of colonialism. And an ethical manifestation of colonialism. And that is what is called the coloniality of knowledge. That colonialism changes the ways that people think. It changes the ways that people reason. It changes the thought structures within the person's mind, their moral reference point. Their value structure becomes redefined by the colonizing nation. So they are stripped of their own indigenous value system. They're stripped of their own indigenous source of guidance. And for us as Muslims, what we see is that the impact of that kind of colonialism is stripping Muslims of their Quranic guidance, their understanding of the Quranic principles, which we understand are actually the divine revelation, right? That is the basis for our moral judgment. So colonialism is it's more subtle and surreptitious manifestation is this kind of coloniality of knowledge. So we have to decolonize our epistemology. We have to decolonize our knowledge structures, decolonize our moral values, and go back to the Quranic guidance. And that's what this is all about, this project. So when we look at the Quranic guidance, we have to say, how are these verses of the Quran actually teaching us what is right and what is wrong? How are they teaching us how to live ethically? How are they teaching us what our worldview should be? And then we do a comparison. And that comparative analysis is very important to contrast what the Quranic guidance is bringing us with what man-made doctrines, what these concocted ideologies are preaching to people. And we see that Surah Al-Fatiha itself shows us the importance of this kind of comparative analysis, right? Surah Al-Fatiha itself tells us not just, ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim, but it tells us صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين, right? It tells us guide us on the straight path, but it also tells us that comparison. what is that straight path, right? Because everyone's going to claim, well, ours is the straight path. Well, the comparison comes. The path of those whom you have favored, the prophets, those who live by the truth, the siddiqeen, and race to accept the truth, those who die upon the truth, the shuhada, the martyrs, the righteous, the people who live ethical lives, lives of virtue, who live according to the principles of truth and justice in all of its facets. Those are the ones who we want to follow their path. The people who are living according to the guidance of the prophets, not the path of al-maghdubi alayhim wal-dallin, right? Those who have incurred anger, those who have gone astray. So we have to understand who are those referred to by the verses to ensure that we understand the Quranic guidance properly. So right from the get-go, right from the very beginning of the Quran is telling us that we need to be able to contrast the Quranic value structure and the Quranic message of guidance with ideologies, false ideologies that are misguiding people, that are sources of misguidance. In order to understand what we have, in order to understand what the forces of corruption that can lead us astray from this guidance, right? So Surah Al-Fatiha explains to us that there's no guarantee, right? It's just receiving the book from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, receiving the revelation itself is not a guarantee that you're going to end up on the right path. There are nations and communities before us who received divine guidance and still went astray. And so therefore, we need to understand, why did they go astray? And what are the principles of guidance we need to ground ourselves in to avoid that path? So that's what Surah Al-Fatiha gives us. Now, when it comes to understanding the ideologies of our time, here we also need to have a very rigorous understanding. You know, a lot of people will come along and say, well, Islam answers this ideology or that viewpoint or whatever, and it's like a very superficial, surface level critique. And it's not grounded in a very academic understanding of the sources of misguidance, right? And the factors that are causing people to end up in a morally dysfunctional worldview. So there we also have to have an analytic approach, an academic approach that carefully considers what are some of the critiques of this ideology, of these ideologies that have come from a variety of sources. It doesn't have to come from Muslim sources, but even non-Muslim sources. How have they examined the moral implications of these ideologies? And what are critiques that arise from those moral implications? One of the frameworks that I talk about in the introduction to this book is a framework that's mentioned by Professor Wael Hallaq. And he talks about this idea of psychoepistemic disorders, right? These, which you can explain as morally problematic worldviews or dysfunctional ways of thinking and understanding reality. So these isms that people talk about today, you know, capitalism, secularism, liberalism, he calls these psychoepistemic disorders. These are dysfunctional ways of thinking and ways of being in the world that have disrupted people's connection to their moral responsibilities and their ethical duties. And that's why we see these genocides unfolding, right? So the genocides are not, you know, purely the result of political factions. They go deeper than that to ideologies and the way in which the ideologies which govern the present world order have structured people's thought process so that they cannot even raise any moral concern about an ongoing genocide. So people become completely engrossed in moral apathy. They just don't care. They just totally disregard what is happening because they see the others as lesser beings, unworthy of their empathy or compassion, or they're so consumed in the capitalist, consumerist society that they're constantly engrossed in the gratification of their own desires, in the pursuit of materialistic pleasures, or simply the constant distractions that capitalist entertainment industry throws at us. Right? We are constantly bombarded with messages that distract us, that delude us, and that displace our focus from what is actually ethically important and valuable, which is our moral responsibilities and our spiritual duties, our moral duties, our purpose in life. So when it comes to the Quranic guidance, Surah Al-Fatiha is reminding us of our purpose in life, right? We can look at the verse, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, right? This is the centerpiece of Surah Al-Fatiha. You alone do we worship, and from you alone do we ask for help. Now, this is really interesting because the self-help industry is one of the biggest industries today. People are constantly reading and consuming books that have to do with how to attain success financially or in one's social life, or how to get people to like you, how to have successful conversations, how to have success in finding a romantic partner, or all of these different notions of success, which are, of course, structured by the liberal and capitalist mentality. But people are constantly bombarded with this, and people have an obsessive interest with this self-help industry. And yet, the success of something can never be disconnected from its purpose in life. And that goes for human beings as well. You can't claim to have succeeded at something if you haven't fulfilled the purpose of the task you were assigned. And therefore, when it comes to having a proper understanding of what it means to live a successful life, we have to fulfill our purpose in life. And it's so interesting how much people are dismissive of the question of purpose of life, or just completely relativistic. Either they're nihilistic and they say there is no meaning of life, there's no purpose of life, and just go and enjoy your life, right? Just go and gratify your desires, live life to the fullest, make as much money as you can, indulge in whatever you want to do whatever makes you happy, right? And that's why people absolutely don't care about moral responsibilities or an ongoing genocide, because why should they? Their purpose of life is just to maximize their own personal pleasures, and there is no ultimate or higher purpose to their existence. Or people are completely relativistic. If they're not nihilistic, they're relativistic, and they say, well, the purpose is whatever you want it to be. And that, to a certain extent, is exactly the same, or it could be even worse. It's more explicitly telling people to make up their own purpose in life. So these are the two answers people often get. And so, of course, there will be no coherent understanding of what it means to live a successful life if your understanding of the purpose of life is either nihilistic or relativistic. And we see this solved within Surah Al-Fatiha itself. When we say, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, you alone do we worship, and we understand that this is our purpose behind our existence. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in Surah Al-Dhariyat, وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ, I have not created the human being or the jinn except to worship me. And what does that worship entail? It's not just performing prayers or recitation of the Quran. Worship in Islam is a comprehensive notion that includes all of our commitments and duties, all of the things that the deen has made an obligation upon us, and all of the things that the deen has recommended for us to do. All of this is included within ibadah. It's complete, comprehensive, following the guidance of Islam. And that guidance entails that we have to live our lives striving to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, spiritually, morally, striving to fulfill our responsibilities that come about as a result of the rights of creation upon us, not only the rights of the Creator upon us, but fulfilling the rights of the creation upon us. That is also part of our ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, our worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, when we understand what it means when we say, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, you alone do we serve, that is liberating us from the delusions and the distractions of society, and liberating us by allowing us to recognize our true purpose in life, our ethical and moral duty to strive to live a life of justice, to strive to pursue truth, to strive to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and to live on this earth as a moral vicegerent, right? As a khalifa, establishing justice on this earth. So once a person understands that, they cannot simply see acts of manifest injustice and oppression and just totally disregard them and say, well, it's not my concern. So you see how just comparing the purpose of life, the meaning of life, and understanding what the Quran is telling us, right away we see how the Quranic guidance is so vast and so deep in its implications, and how it is so pertinent to the challenges that we face today. And you can go further and actually examine the balagha of the verse and look at how that also structures the moral guidance that the verse is giving us. So, for example, why does the verse have iyaka before na'budu, right? Why does it say, you alone do we worship? Even though the more expected order, based on what is customary in the Arabic language, would be to have the word na'budu first, right? We worship you alone. But iyaka has been brought to the front. Now, there is that linguistic subtlety has an ethical implication behind it. What is significant about our worship is not the fact that we are worshiping. It is the fact that our worship is exclusively for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the exclusivity is what makes it morally upright. It's what makes it ethically valuable. We may be doing all sorts of worship or servitude, but if our servitude and our adoration and our obedience is directed towards the false idols of society that lead people astray, then there is absolutely no moral value to that kind of servitude. So what is significant is not the fact that we are worshiping, because every human being is engaged in some type of worship. The question is to whom we are directing that worship. That's what is morally significant. And that is why the word iyaka is first. Iyaka na'budu. Right? You alone do we worship. So when we understand that, we can connect it with other verses in the Quran, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you not seen the one who takes as his own God his desires, who takes his own desires as his God? Right? وَأَضَلَّهُ اللَّهُ عَلَى عِلْمٍ. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, knowing this, causes him to go astray. وَخَتَمَ عَلَى سَمْعِهِ وَقَلْبِهِ وَجَعَلَ عَلَى بَصَرِهِ غِشَاوَةً. And he puts a seal on his hearing and his heart, and puts a covering over his ears. So now this person's epistemic faculties, their faculties of gaining knowledge and understanding what is true and false in the world, have been completely sealed off. They've been completely blocked. They are in epistemic dysfunction because of their ethical dysfunction, because they took their own desires as something to be worshipped. And now you look at modern society, right, and our what has been called the de facto polytheistic society, where people are engaged in the worship of icons of the entertainment industry, right? People are engaged in celebrity worship. People are engaged in the worship of YouTube influencers. People are engaged in the worship of social media likes. People are engaged in the worship of materialistic pleasures. And so it's no surprise when that is a person's frame of reference and moral reference point. And that is the taghut, the false idol to which a person subjugates themselves. It's no surprise that they will encounter moral dysfunction as a result of that. So looking at this verse, Iyaka na'bud, you alone do we worship, it is perfectly, not only the meaning of the verse, understanding the meaning of the word ibadah, but even understanding the syntax of the verse and the balagha, the eloquence of the verse, allows us to extract lessons that we can then apply and see how it totally transforms the way in which we look at society around us, and totally transforms our understanding of our purpose in life, our moral responsibilities, and completely distinguishes the Islamic worldview from the dominant ideologies of misguidance that are causing people to completely abdicate their moral responsibilities and completely be distracted and deluded from their purpose of life. And this is where, there are some diagrams that we have illustrating this in the book. So, Islam, with its singular focus on the human being's commitment to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this allows a person to have a clear sense of their moral responsibility and their purpose in life. And we explain, in this chapter, I've explained that the concept of worship, ibadah, it entails love, right? And so love is that fundamental guiding emotion behind our commitment, is the love of God that motivates the human being to make endless sacrifices to come closer to Him. People see the suffering and the plight of the Palestinians and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And many people have become Muslim because they're looking at their resilience and they're saying, what is giving these people the strength to defy all the false idols of society, to defy all the world powers that want their complete destruction, and to continue to insist on their servitude and devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? What is giving them that power that allows them to overcome these struggles? And so this is where the devotion to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is something that not only is it something that allows us to fulfill our purpose in life, but it shows other people the reality of what the Islamic message is. Whereas when you compare it to the idols of modern polytheistic culture, people are devoted to multiple false gods, includes the worship of money, fame, power, and self. And it's easy to see how that leads to the type of ethical dysfunction that we see in society today, right? Where people are too distracted by, let's say, the latest movie coming out, or the events of the Oscar award ceremony, than to look at and what's happening in the genocide in Gaza. And when one person, the Palestinian film director who receives an Oscars, is even brutally assaulted, people still are so cautious not to go off script and say, no, but that's not what this is all about. We just care about the entertainment side of things, right? That's the deity that they worship. So understanding this allows us to see how the Quranic guidance completely changes our narrative, completely changes our frame of reference and our value structure. Now, when we talk about this central verse in Surah Al-Fatiha, إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, let's reflect also on this part, the second part of the verse, وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. From you alone do we ask for help, or you alone do we ask for help, or from you alone do we ask for help. We mentioned that the people are constantly seeking help, right? The modern self-help industry is one of the largest industries of literature that people are constantly consuming. They're chasing different notions of success. But really, we have to understand that it is only through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that the human being acquires anything in life. And therefore, we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help. We turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help in fulfilling our purpose in life, for fulfilling our worship and our devotion to Him and our moral responsibility as human beings. And we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help in all of our affairs. And if we as Muslims really internalized what this short phrase meant, then we would not have this constant clamor of people talking about where is the help going to come? The plight of the ummah, who's going to solve it for us? Which nation is going to rescue us? Which institution is going to solve this? Maybe this country, this government, this institution will come in and save the day. And they put their tawakkul, they put their complete and absolute trust in different aspects of the creation, rather than relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, relying on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't mean that a person neglects the means. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has made means by which success is attained, right? So There is اتخاذ الأسباب. We have to take the means. We have to seize the means that will bring us to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But having that trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ensures that we know that when we take those means, we're not expecting the result from those means alone, right? A person goes and they protest, they write letters to their political figures, they contact those who they know. They're using their means of advocacy, whatever they believe to be the most effective, but they know that the results are going to ultimately come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And that makes a person not despondent. They won't despair, because even if it seems like things aren't improving, at the end of the day, who's in control? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will decree success and victory at the time when His wisdom dictates it to be the most perfect moment. So there's no sense in putting one's complete trust and reliance in objects of the creation. One has to put one's trust and reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So just from looking at this verse, you see how it completely transforms the way in which our moral worldview is structured. So the book goes through this in much greater detail, but we do it for every single segment of each verse, and looks at how it factors into addressing the confusions that we have in our times. And it's something that my hope is, when people read this book, they will, number one, appreciate how often we take these verses for granted, right? We recite Surah Al-Fatiha 17 times a day, a minimum in our salawat. And often we're reciting the verses without reflecting on the meaning. And if we just pause to reflect on what we're saying and the promise we are making to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when we recite these verses, when we say, "You alone do we worship, and from you alone do we ask for help," we are taking up a tremendous responsibility when we recite these verses, and it would completely change the way in which we live our lives, right? So that's one of the goals. The other goal is this: reflecting on the verses in this manner is meant to change the way in which we engage with the rest of the Quran, and really reflect on the Quran in a way that allows us to turn to it as our source of guidance, and as our moral reference point, as our solution for the challenges in which we face, and allow us to really have a Quranic worldview. And that's something that we can see through just about every single verse in Surah Al-Fatiha. So let's talk about one of the other verses in the surah, which is the verse Ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. And we talk about how Surah Al-Fatiha is a dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a supplication. So if it is a prayer, if it is a dua, what are we requesting? What are we asking for? We're asking for one thing, which is the greatest thing one can ask for, which is guidance. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's guidance. And when we say as-sirat al-mustaqim, the straight path, it immediately dismisses this idea of relativism that I mentioned earlier. Relativism is the idea that truth or moral values are completely dependent on who's talking, what is true and what is right will differ between different cultures, different people, and there is no absolute correct answer. There's no one right answer. It's easy to see how that relativism about worldviews ends up with a relativism about moral values, where people then say, well, okay, there's two sides to this conflict. There's two sides to this dispute, and we need to have this both-sidism, right? This fallacy called both-sidism, where we bring both sides and we say, look, we respect both sides. We don't want to get in the middle of this dispute. Everyone has an opinion on this. It's a very charged issue. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. That kind of statement, that so-called neutrality, is actually a profound moral failure. When there is a clear, form of injustice, relativism becomes a tool that allows that injustice to perpetuate. So we see how the modern world's relativistic outlook has precipitated this moral crisis. And we see how this verse of Surah Al-Fatiha, it rescues us from that. There is a straight path. What is that path? That path is the guidance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has revealed in the Quran. That path is the guidance of Islam. That path is the commitment to the moral and ethical teachings that the prophets and messengers brought. When we look at the verse in Surah Al-Hadid where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لقد أرسلنا رسلنا بالبينات وأنزلنا معهم الكتاب والميزان ليقوم الناس بالقسط. Verily we have sent our messengers with clear signs, and we sent with them the scales of justice and the scriptures, so that people would uphold justice amongst themselves. Imam Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah mentions this shows us that the reason for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sending His divine guidance and His messengers and prophets is so that people would uphold justice in its complete and comprehensive conception. So this verse and the Quranic guidance is guiding us back to that commitment to truth, that commitment to justice. And we can see that without a clear set of guiding principles concerning truth and justice, human beings inevitably succumb to relativism in the face of intractable moral disagreements, or what they claim are intractable moral disagreements. So this verse has, a significant implication for us, and also just the language of the verse itself. Think about the image that is being created here. Islam is being likened not to a station, but a path. So it's not being Muslim is not something static where you say, I'm Muslim, right? I've done my duty. I've embraced Islam. I call myself Muslim. That's it. It's a label. I'm in the box, right? I'm in the box. I'm in the station of those who are saved. That's not how we as Muslims view our faith. The meaning of Islam is that I am committed to continuously walking upon a path. So within the very meaning of Islam, within the very meaning of the straight path, is an understanding that Islam is not something that calls upon us to be in a state of stasis. It calls upon us to pursue a dynamic journey, a journey of constant transformation of ourselves. Right? We're constantly called upon to renew our commitment to the principles of Islam and to continuously improve in the way that we apply those principles of morality and justice in our lives, those principles of perfectly trying to adhere to the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when it comes to the rights of our Creator and the rights of the creation upon us. It is a constant journey towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And, even then when we talk about the language of the verse, why does it say guide us on the straight path? For example, if you want to translate it in English, ihdina as-sirat al-mustaqim. There's actually really no preposition there in the Arabic language. It is guide us the straight path, right? But in English, to make it grammatically make sense, we have to use a preposition. But in the Arabic language, there's different ways to word that. It could have been ihdina ila as-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us towards the straight path, or ihdina lis-sirat al-mustaqim, guide us to the straight path, right? With some kind of preposition there. But if that were the case, if it was worded that way, it would emphasize only what's called hidayatul irshad, being shown what is the straight path, being shown this is Islam, this is what Islam teaches. But it wouldn't include a request to actually seek Allah's help to enable us to follow that guidance in our lives, right? It would just be show us, teach us what is right, not enable us to act upon what is right, enable us to live according to what is right, enable us to ceaselessly strive and sacrifice to come closer to you through doing what is right. That is what is entailed by the wording of the verse. So you can see the level of depth and meaning, again, in a verse that we recite all the time and we take for granted. And then when it comes to the concept of guidance itself, people have this understanding of why do we need religion to be good, or why do we need Islam to be good? Why can't, people just figure out for themselves what is morally right and morally wrong? And we see that It's not the case, and we can see that with respect to four different domains of morality. The first is ontology, the actual existence of moral truths. Is there such a thing as good and evil? There are people who are moral abolitionists who say that we should just get rid of the concept of good and evil. It's just subjective. It's just whatever people want to consider good, whatever people want to consider evil. So we just get rid of it. There is no such thing. The universe is just composed of material stuff. We're all just made out of atoms, and there's just different arrangements of the atoms. There's no basis to understand that there can be such a thing as objective morality. So that's one level at which people can totally disregard the concept of morality. The second is the idea of moral epistemology, moral knowledge. How do I know what is good and what is evil? And again, people may agree there is such a thing as justice, but everyone has their own definition of what is justice. Or people, they may not provide it as an explicit definition, but they have an implicit bias. They only complain or protest when oppression or injustice is done to a member of their own ethnicity, as we see with the type of white supremacism behind colonialism, right? It's about the disregarding the suffering of the colonized people, or the suffering of the global south, or the suffering of people of color, or oppression that's done to them. It will never merit the same level of headlines in the news because their lives are considered deemed to be less worthy of people's moral attention. And so that's another profound problem that comes out of it. The third thing is moral development. Once you understand what is good and what is evil, and you agree upon a definition or understanding, how do you actually develop the motivation to the motivation psychologically, so that you are willing to give up and sacrifice of your own personal pleasure in order to bring about justice in the world, in order to alleviate the suffering of others, in order to strive to come closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ramadan is all about building that motivation for us, where we distance ourselves from worldly pleasures, and we teach and train ourselves through the guidance of the Quran, the guidance of Islam, the guidance that we're getting during the month of Ramadan. We're training ourselves to forego our own personal worldly pleasures and strive in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Strive to come closer to Him by focusing on nurturing our souls through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through the acts of worship, by reminding ourselves also of our duty and commitment to increase in generosity towards those in need, to provide of our wealth to others in our zakat, right? All of these different moral lessons come about. And you need to have a type of training for that. People say, oh yeah, I think it's a good idea to be moral, but they have no psychological motivation. There is no way to train people to actually live a moral life when people believe that the purpose of life is completely either it's nihilistic and there is no purpose, or it's relativistic. It's just whatever you want, whatever you want it to be. And then the fourth point is, the societal aspect. How do we create a community that cares about these sacred values and protects these values, the values of virtue, of justice, of truth, of collectively moving towards bringing people out of destitution and deprivation and oppression, and bringing people towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His guidance. Without a foundation of sacred values, there's no way to organize society around shared ethical aims and objectives. And what ends up happening is the political interests of the state dictate for people what will be regarded as right and what will be regarded as wrong. And if anyone opposes that, they're quickly deplatformed or silenced in some fashion or other. So these domains of morality show us that, you need to have a proper value system, right? Everyone has to have a value system. Everyone does. And the question is whether your value system is coherent or not. Everyone does have a value system. The only question is whether it is a value system that is coherent, that is actually ethical, or whether it is not. And so that's the other aspect that we can see from these verses as well. The last thing that I will mention, when we come to the last verse, صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. Let me go to an interesting comment about this verse by Imam Ash-Shatibi. So if you look over here, so Imam Abu Ishaq Ash-Shatibi, when he talks about what does it mean when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says those who have gone astray, he said, included in this are also, the polytheists who associate other gods with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who take false gods besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he says it is also not far-fetched to say that those who have gone astray include anyone who has deviated from the straight path, whether they belong to this ummah or not. Anyone who deviates from the straight path. So it's not about otherization, right? This is referring to other communities, so there's nothing we as Muslims can learn from it. No, we have to take an ethical lesson from this verse and understand what are the reasons for misguidance. And so that's as well where scholars of Islam, they explain that there is a reason why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions, these groups, غَيْرِ الْمَغْضُوبِ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا الضَّالِّينَ, the ones who have earned anger and the ones who have gone astray. So, for example, Imam Ibn al-Qayyim says, the one who incurs wrath is in error for lacking the guidance to practice his knowledge. Okay, so it's somebody who has knowledge but doesn't act upon it. Whereas the one who goes astray is somebody who acts without knowledge. So we know that in Islam, there is both ilm and amal. Iman is built upon ilm and amal, knowledge and action. And the two paths of misguidance here, the scholars of Islam, they were not content to just say, well, this doesn't refer to us. We don't have to worry about this. No, they said this refers to two underlying disorders, right? The thought disorders. One is actions without, one is knowledge without action, which is al-maghdubi alayhim, and the other one is actions without knowledge. And when you look at that and you extrapolate to see what are the groups, in the modern era, which to whom these descriptions apply, and what are the ideologies to whom these descriptions apply, we can see, on the one hand, we have, for example, the proponents of liberalism who talk about enlightenment reason. Oh, we can know the truth, right? We can know the truth. We don't need any religion to tell us what is the truth. But the Enlightenment reason, the project of the European Enlightenment, was closely connected to the project of colonialism. And so a complete disregard for justice and acting ethically. So there's a claim to knowledge and reason, but a disregard for justice and action and righteous action. And everything becomes about just the only value in which society is organized is around this idea of maximizing freedom. And it's a negative conception of freedom, right? People should be free to do whatever they want, right? Just live life to the fullest, maximize their desires. And there's no ethical duty built into the structure of society or a person's worldview. And then you have the idea of action without guidance, and that perfectly applies to postmodernism, where it's like there is no objective truth. There is no objective, understanding of what we should believe, but there is entirely a program of what we will declare to be right and wrong, and what is considered woke and not woke or whatever. And that commitment to that is how we will label people and determine who is on the right path and who's on the wrong path, with a complete disregard for actually evaluating beliefs and what is true and what isn't true, and disregarding guidance as just, these grand narratives that people tell themselves that have no actual basis in reality, right? So that is how you see the underlying lessons that the verse is imparting to us. You can see how those lessons can be extended and applied to so many different sources of moral confusion and chaos in our times. So that's just, a snapshot of some of the analysis in the book. And of course, there's lots of references, lots of discussion of works of tafsir, and there's also a lot of analysis of philosophical analysis of different ideologies in the book, which I really hope that it's people can find within it a basic framework, a textbook to understand the subject and build on it and change the way that we engage with the Quran and understand how the Quranic guidance is universal, and it really calls upon us as Muslims to live the most ethical lives and calls upon us to transform the way that we live in the world. And I ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us of those who are firm upon the straight path and who follow in the footsteps of his prophets and messengers, and especially our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he protect us from all the forces of moral corruption and destruction and misguidance in the world today. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accept all of our ibadat. هذا وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Happy to take any questions and open it up for discussion.
Jazakallah khairan for that. I appreciate it very much for your time. As you said, we're open for questions, so if you want to type them in the chat or come off mute, we can take your questions. The first question is by actually Brother Iyad Hilal, so you can go ahead and unmute yourself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
Jazakumullahu khairan for this. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. I personally learned a lot from it. Alhamdulillah. I'm going to update whatever I wrote regarding the tafsir of Surah Al-Fatiha. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen.
Alhamdulillah.
The question is the following. At the very beginning of your speech, you talked about قواعد التفسير, the principles of tafsir, that they are very much needed if someone wants to have a scholarly work on the tafsir, which is absolutely correct. And then you mentioned an example, so it's not up to someone to just sit, relax, and say, well, this is what I understand from this ayah. Yeah, that's right. But there are now some people who say, look, what is needed is just to have the tadabbur. So this is my tadabbur. They bring all of unacceptable views regarding many ayat, and they will tell us, okay, this is the tadabbur. So can the tadabbur be done without actually understanding the tafsir based on a methodology, based on قواعد التفسير? Is it up to me or up to you or up to anyone to say, well, this is my tadabbur? And then they will say, Nisa is not meant to be a woman, but rather meant to be a delay in something, as an example. Barakallah fi.
Okay, Jazakallah khair. So excellent question. So it really comes down to what is the difference between tafsir and tadabbur, and how do we understand and apply both? So first of all, one cannot claim that they are doing I'm just doing tadabbur, I'm just reflecting, and they're changing the meaning of the verse, or they're explaining what the verse means. So the starting point for our tadabbur is to make sure, or I would say the test of our tadabbur is to make sure we have the correct understanding of the verse, right? So it doesn't mean that anyone reads the Quran, you can't read a translation and you always have to read 100 pages of tafsir for every verse before you can do any reflection on it. That's not the point here. You can reflect on the verse, but you have to make sure before you say, this is what the verse means, you have to make sure that you're not going against what is the understanding that is in the works of tafsir, the understanding that the Sahaba had of the verse, for example, right? So even the meaning of the word tadabbur, for example, the word tadabbur, Imam al-Shatibi uses it to explain the concept of maqasid, right? Imam al-Shatibi explains that the word tadabbur, it means looking at the end of something, right? And looking at the end of something. So you're looking at what things lead to. So you're trying to understand what is the maqsad, what is the maqsad, the purpose of the verse. To do that, you first have to understand what the verse means. So when it comes to understanding the meaning of the words, right? We want to rely on a accurate translation. If somebody doesn't know Arabic, rely on an accurate translation. What I actually recommend for people is read more. If you don't understand Arabic, read more than one translation. Pull up multiple translations, read more than one translation. It'll help you understand the verse more accurately. So you want to understand the correct meaning of the verse itself. You want to understand the verse in line with the foundational principles of Islam, right? So you have to have a good understanding of your aqidah. You want to also improve your Arabic understanding so you can get that basic understanding from the verse. And you want to make sure that before you start giving some kind of, when you start going from, this is just a simple application of the meaning to this is what the verse means, and I'm kind of talking more about interpretation, I need to get more into the works of tafsir to make sure I have the correct interpretation of the verse. I have to make sure I have the correct interpretation before I just start talking about it. So I don't know if that answers your question. If you want to comment on it any further, Sheikh Iyad.
Oh, barakallah feek. Exactly. Jazakallah khairan.
Okay. وإياكم.
Inshallah.
The next question is from Yahya. In the language of Ihdina Sirat al-Mustaqim, can we also derive the meaning of show us what the path is itself in addition to guiding us to it, along with what was mentioned in showing us how to adhere to it?
Yes, exactly. So the way the verse is worded, it includes both forms of hidayah. It includes and encompasses both forms. So it includes hidayatul irshad, show us what the path of truth is, show us what the path of guidance is, and it includes hidayatul tawfiq, help us to actually follow it and implement it in our lives. So both of those types of hidayah are included because of the way the verse is structured syntactically. And that's mentioned in the chapter. Any other? Do you want me to just read from the chat? I can see the questions in the chat.
Yeah, I can also read them out too.
Okay, I can look at it. I see there's another one. Suggestion: make a version of this book addressed to non-Muslims as da'wah. I wrote this book actually with the understanding that the intended audience is both Muslim and non-Muslim, and you're welcome to share this book with non-Muslims as well. I understand that for some people it may seem like it's quite technical, but everything that's in the book is explained very clearly. It does go through a lot of terminology, but it's if somebody is a studious reader, they'll be able to get through it. As for making a simplified version of the book, that's always something, can be an ongoing project. I think that this book can be turned into curricula for schools, for different programs. It can be dealt with, at the level of educating children, teenagers, university students, and people of all different ages. The lessons can be distilled at every level. So I definitely appreciate that suggestion, and I think it is an ongoing project. Have this book translated into Arabic. So that is something that I thought about, and I'm open to it. There's, certain translations are underway. The thing to consider, however, is whether the audience for the translation has the same concerns in mind and the same ideas and questions in mind as the original audience, because maybe the most important isms for people in the Arab world are going to be different, right? Maybe the most important isms will look a little bit different, and that's why it's not just a question of let's go ahead and translate. Of course, we can do that, but it's also good to have some research behind that to make sure that it'll really have the maximum impact. But I'm always open to those kind of ideas and suggestions, so I appreciate that. And then for those who want to, again, for those who join later, want a copy of the book, it's available as a free download. You just go to the link that was shared in the chat, which is it's on Yaqeen Institute, The Straight Path, How Surat al-Fatiha Addresses Modern Ideologies. You can Google it and it should come up as well. And then it just asks for your email and you download the PDF. And you can share the PDF as well with whoever you want. It's a free ebook. And for those who want a printed copy, the printed copy will be published by Cube, and should be widely available in August of this year, inshallah. Any other questions?
If anyone also wants to come off of mic, they can ask their question live too.
And I also know that it's the final few hours of Ramadan, depending on if Eid is tomorrow for you, then it's the final few hours, and people may want to make the most of these hours, inshallah ta'ala. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala again accept our fasting and our acts of worship, and make us amongst the salihin, and make it a source of relief and for our ummah as we enter into the blessed day of Eid. Yeah, Brother Ziad, go ahead with your question, please.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Jazakumullah khairan for your
Assalamu alaikum.
presentation. I was curious to know how you'd respond to the general. Sorry, I got a baby here. How you'd respond to the general observation or point, maybe even criticism that some of these isms are not like the other, in the sense that, okay, look, we have postmodernism. Here you've, for example, cited Wael Hallaq, who I don't know if people would broadly say is of the postmodern tradition. Many of which postmodern arguments are used to destabilize scientism, materialism, and why would that therefore be included in that same sort of list of isms, so to speak? Or like you had said, we needed a more mature understanding of how these isms are dismantled, and oftentimes critical theory, postmodernism offer that.
Yeah, so that's something I'm talking about in the book as well. So in postmodernism can be a very useful tool. It brings with it several useful tools and frameworks that people use to critique the excesses of liberalism and the problems of Enlightenment thought. But again, our reference point is not postmodernism. Our reference point is the Quran. And so where postmodernism gives us something that is useful and that is correct, we can benefit from it. And where it gives us something that undermines the notion of truth itself, as postmodernism does, we have to reject it. Right? And this is something where, I also quote, some interesting points from, different sources about how postmodernism itself claims to free us from colonialism. It claims to bring about this project of decolonialism. And yet, postmodernism actually serves to advance another type of colonialism. And we see how Muslims are being subjected to another pressure of changing their value structure to adhere to a particular set of notions that come out of postmodernism. And so it again forces people to change the way in which they understand their own beliefs. So, for example, I think there's an important quote here. Yeah, I mean, there's some points by Ziauddin Sardar that are mentioned in the chapter that speak to that. But I recommend reading the whole chapter on postmodernism to address that point. Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a quick question. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the
Assalamu alaikum.
presentation. I'd like to know what was your career path? How did you come to this stage? And are you working on something? What have you worked on, other projects, or, books or lectures? That'd be great to follow up with.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I have a somewhat atypical career path for somebody writing such a work. So professionally, I'm a medical doctor, and I work as a medical doctor. I'm a specialist in neuroradiology, which is imaging of diseases of the brain and spine, central nervous system. So I have a very specialized area of medicine that is my day job. And my pursuit of Islamic studies was always, through traditional route, and it was a passion for me, partly related to my my studies of through university, being immersed in these scientific worldview, and especially going through undergrad at the time when the new atheist movement was at its pinnacle, realizing that it's if I'm going to talk about science, I need to talk about the worldview in which science makes sense. And so that kind of led me back to making sure I have a strong understanding of not just the Islamic teachings and through a traditional route of learning, but really understanding the worldview that comes from those teachings. And that's kind of been my interest in Aqidah. And I've pursued that not just in traditional fashion, but now in an academic setting as well. So currently, what I'm currently working on, towards the final stages of, is finishing my doctorate, my PhD, which I'm doing as a distance learning student through the University of Nottingham. It's a PhD in Islamic theology, and specifically looking at the epistemology of religious belief. So all of these themes here are very much connected with what I'm studying there, which is, the epistemology of religious belief. How do we know what is true? How do we know that Islam is the truth? What is the correct way to understand our source of guidance in life? So that's always been my interest, and that's something that I hope, inshallah ta'ala, will be in the published book form soon. After completing the PhD. In terms of other work that I've done, most of it you can find on Yaqeen Institute. If you just search my name there, you'll see a number of articles. And there's different podcasts I've done as well on the subject of this book and other topics. You can see, for example, on blogging theology, I have a couple of podcasts. So I appreciate that question, and hope that question motivates me to keep active and producing something useful that's of benefit, inshallah ta'ala. And whatever benefit is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whatever mistakes and shortcomings are from myself and from shaitan. All right. Jazakumullahu khairan. I think that's it, unless there's any other comments.
بس بارك الله فيك دكتور.
بارك الله فيك. الله يبارك فيكم جميعا.